From the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I'm Stewart Patrick, and this is The World Unpacked. On February 25th, Nigerians went to the polls to cast their vote for Nigeria's next president. 3 days later, Bola Tinubu was declared the victor amid cries by the opposition of electoral fraud and vote rigging. While it remains to be seen how the opposition will fight the results in the courtroom, whoever ascends to the presidency on Inauguration Day will face significant challenges to steer the so-called giant of Africa back on track. Nigeria boasts the largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as its biggest population at more than 200 million. Despite a wealth of riches in oil and a young, vibrant citizenry, Nigeria has suffered from a lackluster economy under its current president, Muhammadu Buhari, as well as decades of endemic corruption. On top of these economic challenges are the security threats, including from the terrorist insurgency Boko Haram, that have left swaths of the country ungoverned. With me today to talk about the election and the future of Nigeria is Ruth Maclean. Ruth is West Africa bureau chief for the New York Times and has been reporting from on the ground in Nigeria. Let's dive in. So, Ruth, Bola Tinubu will be Nigeria's next president. I've read that he's known as the godfather of Lagos. What else can you tell our listeners so they can get up to speed on Nigeria's incoming president?
Well, Bola Tinubu is a very interesting guy. He is known as the godfather of Lagos to some, and that's because he was governor of Lagos state. Lagos is a city and a state. For about 8 years in the early 2000s. But I think the Godfather tag doesn't speak just to his own tenure as governor of Lagos, but also to his successors, because he's quite well known for handpicking the governors of Lagos that have come after him. And so he's really seen as someone who has quite a deep control over what goes on in that city. And, you know, we're talking about the biggest city in Africa, this giant mega city, huge part of Nigeria's economy, you know, magnet for people across the country and region. And so, you know, somebody who has a lot of power in Lagos does automatically have quite a lot of power in Nigeria. So, you know, I think he's been well known in Nigeria for quite a long time for that reason. But it's interesting that some of the details about him and his life are a bit murky. I mean, he says, for example, that he's 70 years old, but a lot of Nigerians question that, and they think he's much older. He lived in the States for a few years, and there's kind of a bit of a shadowy past there because he had to forfeit about $460,000. This is back in the 90s. That apparently, according to the United States, were the proceeds of narcotics trafficking. There have also been corruption cases within Nigeria as well. There are questions often raised about who his parents were. So he's a guy that everybody sort of feels like they know really well, but at the same time, there are things about him that no one really feels they know with any certainty.
So how did he prevail over his rivals? From what I gather, there was normally there's been sort of two parties that have been major players, but from what I gather in this case, there were some novel elements to the election. Could you speak to Nigeria's political landscape? Because I know that in the past, it's also been highly divided along sort of regional, ethnic, and sometimes religious lines. Give us a sense of how it all played out.
Yeah, well, Nigeria is an incredibly diverse country. It's a huge country, as you mentioned. It's got more than 200 million people, we think. I mean, a census is being done pretty soon, so that should become a bit clearer. But it can be quite a polarized country in certain ways. you have a mostly Muslim north and a mostly Christian south. And that's one divide that's often quite salient in Nigerian politics. Then you also have a southeast that tried to secede back in the 60s with the Biafran War. That's history that no one in the country has ever forgotten. And then you have, quite a powerful southwest as well, which is centered around Lagos. But, I think a lot of people really consider political power, to have been quite concentrated in northern hands for quite a few years, which is interesting because, economic power in Nigeria is mostly in the south. The south is where the oil producing regions are. It's where Lagos is. But, the north, everybody thinks, although it's not really clear because of the census issues, everybody thinks the north has more people than the south, and so that carries greater political weight. We've had Bola Tinubu, who is the ruling party candidate. He's a southerner, but he's a southern Muslim, and he's been running with a northern Muslim on the ticket, so that's one break with tradition. He's been running against the kind of traditional opposition candidate, and I say that because not only is he from, so this candidate, Atiku Abubakar, is from the party that governed Nigeria for many years, the People's Democratic Party. So, he is the traditional opposition in a way, but also personally, he had run for president 5 times before 2023. So he's the kind of perennial candidate. So, so far, so expected. But then you had this third candidate in this election, a man called Peter Obi, who, who is kind of an establishment figure himself in a way, a former governor from the southeast, a former longtime member of the People's Democratic Party, so that opposition party I was talking about. But somehow, he broke off from the PDP, joined a very kind of little-known party called the Labour Party, and ran for president and ran a very successful campaign. So he basically turned it into a 3-horse race, and a very interesting one, because we had candidates from each of the main ethnic groups in Nigeria, from each of the regions, and it seemed going into it as if it was wide open.
That is fascinating. So a lot of different dynamics in this particular election. So let's talk about sort of Nigeria's basically what's going to happen now. Tinubu is going to be sworn in as president on May 29th, but the opposition parties have claimed that this was fraudulent. They've said that they were going to take it to the courts. And this all comes after a huge effort at electoral reform in the country. And on March 1st, U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price congratulated Tinubu on his victory.
The United States congratulates the people of Nigeria, President-elect Tinubu, and all political leaders following the declaration by Nigeria's Independent National Electoral Commission, or INEC, on the results of the February 25th presidential election.
Which seemed to give some credibility, or at least American backing, to his presidency. But do you think there's any merit in the opposition's claim that this was a sham election?
I think it's quite hard to know at this point. I mean, perhaps the opposition parties know. The thing is, this year, there were some significant differences in how the election was conducted. So results often are just phoned in or texted in. But this time, you had to take electoral officials had to take a picture of the results sheet and upload it to an online portal. And it didn't always work. There were a lot of glitches, but eventually the idea was anyone could see the result from their particular polling unit. And check that it looked the same as what had gone down in that particular area. So there was this effort at kind of transparency and making it a fairer playing field. What the opposition parties are arguing is that there were problems with that uploading system, which there definitely were. And they're also talking about incidents of violence, which international observers also mentioned.
But Nigeria's elections have descended into disorder.
And then in some cases, they're saying that results were actually not uploaded. They were taken to government houses, manipulated, and then uploaded to the system. So they're basically alleging rigging. Whether, that's on a scale that really amounts to this sham election tag that some of them have given it really remains to be seen. And, they're both of the main opposition parties are launching legal challenges. So hopefully all this will come out in court.
Right, exactly. Hopefully in court as opposed to on the streets. As we know, election violence is something that we're seeing all around the world. We obviously saw it in Brazil earlier this year. We saw it in 2021, in January of 2021 in the United States. Do you have any concerns given threats to Nigeria's political stability in earlier decades? Certainly, that there could be that this kind of violence could spiral out of control.
There have been a couple of protests led by opposition parties. So far, I haven't seen anything really significant. I think maybe when I might have expected to see it would have been right after Tinubu was announced as president, and it didn't happen then. It could be because that happened at 4 a.m. And everybody was asleep. I don't know. But, I sort of think that we probably would have seen it by now if it was going to happen. And definitely I think the opposition parties have been quite careful to not incite their followers to come out on the streets. Both of them have really been calling for calm. And I think a lot of people have been listening to that.
Yeah, it's encouraging given the role that the military sometimes played in Nigerian politics, that it seems to be, in a sense, on the sidelines. You talked about disaffected voters. I was wondering about disaffected non-voters. I read the turnout was sort of surprisingly low, especially compared with the last election in 2019. From what you gathered, were there particular issues that sort of contributed to this apathy? And is this a sense of Nigerian citizens not really having much faith in democracy or having lost faith in political elites in the country? Are there other factors involved, do you think?
I mean, I think that apathy is one factor. I mean, I don't think that the numbers show that it fell that much from the last election. The last election was about 34%, I think, turnout. And that's turnout of registered voters, which is only about, is only less than half the people in the country, although obviously a lot of the other people are too young to vote. But I think, and then, so in 2019, it was about 34%. And this year in 2023, I think it was about 29%. This is a trend that's been going on for years in Nigeria since the rebirth of democracy in 1999. I mean, then and in the election after that, voter turnout was, I think, around 50 or 60%, and it's just been falling ever since. I mean, I do think that there is often the feeling of, well, what can I change with my vote? Nothing seems to change in Nigeria. And I think that's one reason people don't come out. Another thing is elections are often dangerous in Nigeria or completely exhausting. You can wait all day in the hot sun. I spoke to several voters who, turned up in the morning at their polling unit, waited all day, got registered, but in the end, they closed the voting booths before they could cast their vote, came back the next day. It's an all weekend enterprise. And then, you can run the risk of getting attacked. I mean, friends of mine who were out reporting at a polling unit in Lagos this election had guns pointed at them and the presidential ballot box stolen from under their noses. I mean, this does happen, and Nigerians know that. And, I think the calculation is often, is it worth risking my life for this, But I mean, I don't think that it's just apathy. And I think in this election, actually, there were so many people who really wanted to vote. But there were issues. There were issues getting hold of their permanent voters cards. People had to queue up for a long time to get those, and many people went and queued for days and never managed to get it. There were issues on the day. I mean, and I think possibly a factor in seeing the kind of lower turnout from the last election, which wasn't really that expected because it was such a kind of vibrant election, is perhaps that some, ghost voters and sort of elements of the voting roll that weren't necessarily totally legitimate have been excluded this time around.
Well, so that at least is the hopeful aspect of things. I want to talk about a generational aspect in Nigerian politics. As you've noted, Tinubu is a member of the current ruling party led by President Buhari. He's been a mainstay and a kingmaker in Nigerian politics for years. At the same time, he's an aging leader. How aged he is, as you said, is a subject of some speculation. But you've got an incredibly young population that's been seen Nigeria basically hit with economic woes, security threats, and other challenges. What does Tinubu's victory say about the trajectory of Nigeria, do you think, and how people are feeling about the future of the country? Is it a referendum on that, or not really?
I mean, I think, as you say, Nigeria is a very young country. The average age is 18. And
that's extraordinary.
Yeah. I mean, it's similar to many African countries. But it's a huge young country that's driving a huge part of the growth on the African continent. I think there are several signs that Nigerian young people are really not happy with the way things are going in the country. Recently, there's been this phenomenon that in Nigeria is known as Japa, which is basically people just leaving the country. Canada these days is kind of known as Nigeria's second country. There are tons of Nigerians moving or trying to move to Canada. The UK as well. Study visas for Nigerians in the UK have just shot up in the past few years. And, it's interesting talking to young people, particularly in Lagos. They all kind of know the visa regulations and regimes in all of these different Western countries off by heart, and can kind of give you chapter and verse on how to navigate them. So this is really a sad time, I think, for a lot of particularly Nigerian parents who are just watching their children kind of figure out that there's no future for them in their country. And sadly, I think a lot of the young people that I was speaking to before the election, they were saying, if Tinubu wins this, I'm definitely out of here. So, I'll be watching that with interest to see if that really does happen. Obviously, it's not, it's easier said than done, I mean, with a Nigerian passport, it's often very difficult to get into a Western country. They do everything they can to keep you out. So I don't know, how realistic that is for a lot of people, but it gives you a sense of, how young people in Nigeria are feeling about their future.
When we come back, I'll ask Ruth a bit more about the brain drain, what's next for Nigeria in the aftermath of the election, and its impact on the continent and Nigeria's international aspirations. Hey, World Unpacked listeners. I've got a podcast recommendation for you. If you've ever scratched your head over what the heck is going on in Indian politics, you need to listen to Grand Tamasha. Every week, my colleague Milan Vaishnav sifts through the messiness of Indian politics with top policymakers, journalists and academics across India and the wide diaspora community. Check it out on your favorite podcast app. Now, on with the show. So before we went to the break, Ruth, you talked about the brain drain that Nigeria is experiencing as many, many young people in particular wonder whether or not they have a future in the country. It's one of the most pressing challenges. In fact, a 2019 study by Pew showed that 45% of adults in Nigeria say they plan to emigrate within the next 5 years, which is absolutely an extraordinary percentage. It's actually higher than any country that was surveyed. What can Nigeria do you think, to encourage people to stay home and help build their country?
I think what all Nigerians want is security and economic opportunity. And, they're quite basic things in a way, but really they've been lacking for many Nigerians in recent years. I mean, on the security side, everybody knows about Boko Haram and their atrocities in the Northeast. And that is continuing, both with them and their splinter group that became more powerful than them, which is linked to the Islamic State. So, life in the Northeast for ordinary people just remains horrific. But at the same time, there have been all of these problems kind of mushrooming across the country. So in the Northwest, you have what Nigerians often refer to as banditry. And it's not really clear, who's doing it, but these so-called bandits will show up to, say, a school and kidnap a bunch of children and then release them a few weeks later, presumably for ransom. There's all sorts of risks that you run just going about your ordinary life. And everywhere in the country really is experiencing this kind of thing. I mean, you can be an ordinary engineer in the South and get kidnapped for ransom. You can be a commuter on a train. And then in the Southeast, you still have secessionists who are often enforcing sit-at-homes and making life pretty difficult for people there. So, it's just becoming harder and harder for Nigerians to go about their ordinary lives without worrying about their personal safety. And that's something that has also come up often in surveys, that, security and safety are the number one concern for a lot of Nigerians. So that's one thing. And then I think the other is just things like jobs, study opportunities, ways of making a living. I mean, most Nigerians, I think, are employed in the informal economy. So, there aren't even that many formal jobs to start with. Unemployment is very high, particularly among the youth. And then you have other really difficult factors like universities go on strikes that sometimes last years. So it can take, 7 years instead of 4 to get a degree. Then you have sky high inflation, that's sitting currently at about 21% or more. It's just, all of these factors are thrown at Nigerians. And it's just really hard to stay safe and make a living.
So both on human security and also on economic security, two huge issues for Nigerians. And I'd like to think about what President Tinubu is going to be walking into when he gets inaugurated in a couple of months. Are there immediate crises beyond these sort of longer-term structural issues of improving security and employment opportunities for Nigerians that you think await the president?
Well, there's one that really comes to mind at the moment that was a big issue in the lead up to the election, which is the cash crisis.
Right.
Suddenly, I mean, it was a crazy situation. Suddenly the government decided the central bank decided to redesign the naira, which is the currency in Nigeria. So they took out a lot of the old naira notes from circulation, but there weren't enough of the new ones around. I mean, why that was is kind of a subject of dispute. But what happened was that ordinary Nigerians would try to go to the ATM, and then none of the ATMs would have cash in them, or they'd line up, for days, hours and days, just to get kind of a measly, $20 or something equivalent out of the machine. I mean, people were just spending huge chunks of their lives trying to get hold of cash. And then people who couldn't were often unable to pay for basic necessities like food and medicine. It was just, a huge disaster for so many people. There's been a lot of back and forth about the legality of the central bank's move. I mean, we have currency redesigns in many countries, and this doesn't happen. I mean, there are big questions about why it was necessary to set such a tight deadline. All of this was done in a matter of a few months, and the deadline was right before the election. So, there were some court cases over this, taking the government to court, in effect, and trying to stop the deadline from being such a hard deadline. And I think that the current state of play is that, the court has ruled that the deadline for exchanging these notes should now be the end of the year. So, maybe that will start to ease things off a bit, but I don't think it has yet. I think people are still having to line up and still trying to get their hands on the new notes. And I think that's going to be something that that Mr. Tinubu really has to sort out when he comes in. And then another thing that comes to mind is the oil situation. Nigeria is a huge oil producer on the continent traditionally. And it still is, but oil production has really gone down in recent years.
Is that surprising to you? That it's just intuitively it's kind of surprising to me that oil production would have gone down, given particularly in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine and the crisis in energy markets and questions about getting fossil fuels back onto the market.
Well, there's a big conversation in Nigeria about the amount of gas that it has, because it has a ton of gas as well as oil that it's just been flaring off for years. And yes, there's been a lot of criticism about the fact that Nigeria doesn't seem to have capitalized on the demand for oil and gas that there is. I think I can't remember the exact figure, but Nigeria has, not as much gas as Russia, but not far off. So there's incredible potential there. If you could build a pipeline, across the Sahara and through the Mediterranean, I'm no engineer, but, apparently it can be done, then they really could have capitalized on that situation, and they didn't at all. And yes, it is surprising from that point of view. It's also surprising because it's such a massive export for Nigeria. It's how Nigeria gets its money. So, you would think that would be kind of the priority above all else, to make sure that the pumps keep pumping. But, there are a lot of factors in getting that oil out of the ground that have been going on for many years. You have oil theft. You have, this incredibly complex network of aging pipelines that often result in a lot of oil spills. You have local disputes. You have a lot of corruption in the system. And all this has kind of, come to a head, really, and meant that it's been really hard to actually get a lot of that oil out. And it's particularly difficult because Nigeria subsidizes petroleum products for its citizens. So it's paying these huge amounts to subsidize fuel, but at the same time, it's not getting the revenue that it used to from selling the oil.
Right. And from what I gather, the president has actually promised to cut those fuel subsidies, which I could imagine would be an extraordinarily controversial issue, as it has been in so many countries around the world. And of course, over the longer term, Nigeria will be having to contend with a world that, at least in principle, is moving towards greener energy sources. We've already talked about this multitude of challenges that the new president is going to face, and also about the tremendous potential for Nigeria. It, one Nigeria looms large on the African continent, of course, as the most populous country, the largest economy. Were other nations watching this election across the continent? And do you think that people were, like, well, you're in Senegal, I know you're based there. Did people there say, well, this is a bellwether for how West Africa, or perhaps the entire continent is going to go? Was there a lot of attention being paid to what was going on there?
There was a lot of attention from across the continent. And I think a lot of Africans, particularly young Africans who don't live in Nigeria, have never been to Nigeria, felt quite invested in this election. And, I think that a big part of the reason for that is that a lot of this election was kind of conducted online. The third party candidate that I was talking about before, Peter Obi, he had this huge online following that were known after him, Obi, as the obedient. And, you can find obedience, as they call themselves, everywhere on the continent. I think a lot of people who are kind of connected, digitally savvy young people were really rooting for him and his campaign. And so I think, there's that. And I think, yes, there is also a kind of, I think there is some worry or interest in what happens in Nigeria and, what will happen under Tinubu's government because of the spillover effect that it has in the rest of the region. I mean, Boko Haram, for example, that came from Borno in northeastern Nigeria, but it spread into Cameroon and Chad and Niger, three of its neighbors. Whether Nigeria does well or doesn't do well has, knock-on economic effects, security effects on its neighbors and on the rest of the region.
That's really intriguing. The suggestion that you're making seems to be that people in the region are more concerned with the potential weakness of Nigeria and the fact that there are spillovers across its borders, whether these relate to security or economic dislocation or perhaps migration as well, as opposed to the fear of a regional hegemon, right? A major power that might be throwing its weight around in the region. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, I don't think that other countries are really seeing Nigeria as a big power player in that way at the moment. I think, you mentioned at the beginning that it's known as Africa's giant. I think, it's sometimes referred to as Africa's wounded giant. I don't think that I don't think that other African countries are worried about Nigeria sort of taking over, as it were. I mean, as you mentioned, there is a lot of migration, and a lot of Nigerians migrate to other countries in the region, and unfortunately, that leads to a lot of xenophobia in some countries. I mean, particularly in South Africa. But I mean, there's so much positive migration that comes from Nigeria as well, and you see that in the States, where I think Nigerians are the most successful of any of the migrant groups in the States. It's just incredible often how well Nigerians do when they're abroad. And I mean, I've often sort of thought about this analogy that I think somebody once told me about, which is like when Nigerians are at home, they're sort of running a marathon in soup. So the moment they get out, they just fly. So I think, I think people on the rest of the continent, they do know that. And I think that they want Nigeria to realize its full potential as well.
In terms of Nigeria realizing its full potential, do you sense that the incoming government will have any broader international aspirations or global aspirations? One thing that countries on the African continent have complained about for quite some time is the lack of representation of Africa as a continent, but also big players in Africa within international institutions, for instance, the UN Security Council. It's a perennial debate and demand on the part of major countries in Africa that they actually get permanent membership on the UN Security Council. Do you sense that that the Nigerian political elite and perhaps the incoming president are looking to increase the heft of a continent that is one of the few that's really growing very, very fast demographically at a time when so much of the rest of the world is shrinking?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen Tinubu talk about the kind of seats on the UN Security Council or seats on the G20 issue all that much himself. But then again, he really didn't give very many interviews in the run up to the election. But one thing that he has talked about is the need for climate justice and the fact that so many African nations are not polluters at all, but they're often having to pay the price for rich, often Western nations polluting the planet. And this debate of, should we protect our natural resources so that the planet survives, or do we get something in return for this? I've seen him make that point. So, and that is a debate that I think is really interesting that's happening on the African continent right now. You're seeing it from places like the DRC and Gabon. And I wouldn't be surprised if he adds his voice to that call.
Well, Ruth, that brings us to the end of our show. I want to thank you so much for being a wonderful guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked, brought to you by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and please don't forget to rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranata and Clarissa Guerrero and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. Catch you next time.